On this blue collar coder, we're going to do a speed run with GraphQL, Axios, React Query, JWT, refresh tokens, and React. Wow, I think I got it all. Hopefully, this is a viewer request video, and it's kind of a combination of a bunch of viewer requests, but I think this is actually maybe a fairly common use case. So if any of all that confuses you, I hope this helps unconfuse you. So of course, as always, all of this code is available to you on GitHub, so you can check it out either as we're going through it or after. Okay, let's jump over into the terminal and get our application off the ground. So I'm in a directory called temp JWT, and I'm going to use my npx create mf app to build two different apps in this directory. The first one is our React host app, and I'm going to call that host. It's going to be type of application. It's going to be on port 8080, and it's going to be a React app, and I will use TypeScript and Tailwind. And now I'm going to run that again, and I'm going to go create our GraphQL server. So we'll call that, not unsurprisingly, server. It's going to be an API server on port 3000, and I'm going to use the GraphQL Apollo template. There's a bunch of them, but I'm going to use the GraphQL Apollo template for this one. All right, so let's bring up VS Code and have a look around. So I'm going to go and create two terminals. Create one that's in the host directory, and then I'll just yarn to get that going. And I'm going to create another terminal, and I'm going to go into the server directory and pretty much do the same thing. Okay, looks like the server is done. So now I'm going to go and add some dependencies in there, because that's where we're going to start. And to that server, I'm going to add GUID and also JSON Web Token. So these are going to add support for generating a unique ID and also the JSON Web Token. That's going to give us the ability to create a JSON Web Token and then verify the token that comes back to us. And a JSON Web Token in this case, or a JWT or a JWT, depending on how you want to do that. I don't know why it's called JWT. I think it reads better, I guess, than JWT, whatever that would be. So it's a JWT. It's basically going to maintain our user identity. So the first thing we're going to do is authenticate against our GraphQL server using mutation. And then we're going to get back a JWT. And that JWT is going to have in it our identity, but it's also going to be signed by the server so that it can't be spoofed. And then as we go and get some data, it's going to allow the server to then get who we are from that JSON Web Token. So we don't have to tell it who we are. We just add it as part of the header. And then every time we make some requests, we just get our data as opposed to anybody else's, which is really easy. Now, since we're in TypeScript, I need to add the types for that. So I'll just go and add those in. And then let's go have a look at what the code of the server is. It's actually really simple stuff. So we just bring in the Apollo server and GQL. At this point, it's got a little book example in there. We're not going to use that. It's got some books, and it's got a resolver that returns the array of books. And then we just fire up that Apollo server. So it's really just a really nice starting spot that's got all of the TypeScript and everything else ready to go. So we don't want to do books here. We're going to have a bunch of users, and they're all going to have to-dos. And we're going to allow the user to read their to-dos. We're not going to do the full CRUD on the to-dos. That I leave that to you if you want to do that. So first thing we need to do is get some users. So I'm just going to create a new file over in the source directory called users.ts. So this code is just an object. It's got as the key, the string, which in this case is the user name. So like Sally is one of the users and Jane is one of the users. And then each one has their properties. So in this case, Sally's got an ID of 1, password is 123, and to-dos of this. Obviously, passwords in clear text, not good. In fact, this whole structure is not all that great, but really it's just there for us to test. Okay, so then we export this as our export default. So there you go, cool. We're not gonna have to change that again. Now over in here, we're gonna bring in JWT from JSON Web Token and GUID from GUID. Then we're gonna bring in those users that we just created over in that users file. And then we're gonna change these type defs. So I'm going to just have a type def for the query, which is going to get the to-dos. And notice I'm not going to give it a user ID to pass along to ask for a particular user's ID. That's just going to come in from the JWT that's included in the header. And so how do we get that JWT? Well, we call this mutation called authenticate, which has a name and a password and returns a string, and that string is the JWT. So that in any subsequent requests from the client to the server, we then pass that JWT that we got back from the authenticate as a header that goes along with our query. Okay, we don't need these books any longer, so let's get rid of those. Now this books is, for the moment, going to turn into to-dos, and we'll just return at this point an empty array. But what we really want is that authenticate mutation. So I'm going to bring that in. So here's authenticate. So the first value to any resolver is the parent, and we don't have a parent at this point. So that's just, we ignore that entirely. And then it's the argument. So that would be the name and the password as specified here. So you have to have the name. That's why there's an exclamation point there. It's required. Same thing with password. And there you go. And then what we do with that is we check to go and see if we've got that name in our database of users. And then if we have that name, then does the password match the password that we've got back? And then if it is, then we're going to vend a JWT. That's the correct authentication details. So what we're going to do is we are going to sign a JWT, and the data that we're going to sign is the name. So we're just going to use the name as the token. You could use the ID, use whatever you want, but this is essentially secure data. So that's fine. And then we're going to encrypt it with something. So we need to create a JWT secret. We'll get there in a second. And then we need to say how long it's going to last for. So in this case, we're going to vend one that lasts for a whole hour. So what's going to happen is at a certain point, that's going to expire, and then you're going to need to ask the user to re-log in. And that's actually what the refresh token is about. But we'll get to that later on. So that adds a lot of complexity. All right, now, if that didn't work, if they gave the wrong username or password, then we give back an authentication error and say, hey, bad credentials. We don't know you. So now we need that JWT secret. So let's go build that. So I'm just going to shoot up to the top of the file, and we'll just bring in JWT secret. And we'll say, well, hey, if we get a JWT secret from the environment variables, then we'll use that. Otherwise, I'm just going to use secret, which is not exactly a great secret. Obviously not production worthy code. Don't do that. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's go over here, and we are going to now start the server, and we'll bring that up. And that brings up this cute little Apollo UI here. So I'm going to click on that, and that brings up the Apollo Studio, which is really cool. And apparently I've preloaded here some queries. That's great. So the first one we want to do is test out that mutation. So we've got a name here that maps to the variables coming in on the query. In this case, I'm going to put in Jane, 123. We'll run it, and hey, cool, awesome. Now we've vended ourselves a JWT. We got back the authenticate, and we got a JWT there. So now we want to send that back to the server when we do our to-dos. So what we're going to do is we are going to copy this and put this into a value down here. And this is where the headers go. And this is going to be X access token, right? So now this is our access token. And when we do the query, we want to get back the values for, well, who did we sign in as? We signed in as Jane's. We want Jane's to-dos. So let's go back over here to our headers. We'll hit run. And currently we're getting nothing because, well, that's the hard-coded value that we did over here in response to the to-dos. We said nothing. Well, we want to fix that. So the first thing we want to do is set up the context. So there's a third parameter to any resolver. There's the parent, which is the first one. There's the arguments, which is the second one. And then there's context. So into the context, we are going to decode that X access token and say, okay, cool. Well, we verified the JWT and it is this person. And then this to-dos is going to look at that context and use that context to send back the to-dos for that person. So we need to first set up that context. So let's go down here to the Apollo server initialization. And I'm going to bring in a context key. And that's a function. So it gets called on every single request. And then that's got a request on it. And the first thing we're going to do is set up that context. And we're going to say that the name is null. And then we're going to look to see if we have that X access token that we put in the header. So over here, X access token like that. And if we have it, then we're going to do that verify. Now verify throws if it doesn't like it. So that's not great, but that's what we're going to do. But if it doesn't throw, then we're going to look at the data that's coming back. And we know that we stuffed into the data up here the name. So that's going to come back as the token.data. There's a couple of things on token, like the time that's left on the token and all that. All we want in this case is the data. In that case, it's the name. All right, so that's pretty good. And then the next thing we need to do is come over here to to-dos and actually look at that context and get the right data for that person if we have them. Okay, so here we go. So we've got our parent, which is, again, unknown. We don't care. Arguments, we don't care. We are bringing back that context, and that context has a name, which has a string in. There you go. So then we see if we have that name. And if we do not have that name, then we fire again that authentication error. But if we do have that name, we just give back the to-dos. So let's save this out, and then we'll rerun it. And we'll come back over here, and we'll see. Oh, awesome. Okay, so we're hearing that our to-dos as Jane is the learn C and learn C++. So let's go take a look. Is that true? So let's go back over here. We'll go and take a look at users, and we scroll down. We see Jane. Yep, and she's got learn C and learn C++. So perfect. Rockin'. This is great. Okay, so let's go over to our UI and start actually making the requests from our UI. So I'm going to close out these, and then we're going to open up host and go into the host terminal. And then I'm going to add a few things. The first thing I'm going to add is Axios. That's going to be making our request for us, as well as React Query, which is going to bring essentially that Axios query mechanism into the React context and manage all the error states and everything else and do it all as hooks to make it really easy and workable in our React environment. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring in Daishi Kato's React hooks global state. And I've gotten a lot of questions about where to store JWTs and how to store them. And there's some interesting connection here between Axios and also the React stuff. And what's going to happen is that both Axios and also React are going to want to know about that JWT. The React stuff is going to want to know if you have a JWT or not in order to say, well, am I going to show the login UI or am I going to show the to-dos UI? But the Axios stuff is going to actually want to know what the JWT is and maintain the JWT in order to go and send that JWT along as the X-access token. So the way that I do this is I use that React hooks global state to create a state for the JWT in one place that's usable not just by Axios, but also by React. Thank you, Daishi Kato, again, for an awesome library. Okay, so let's go over into the source, and then I'm going to go and create a new file called client.ts and paste into that some imports. So I'm going to bring in use callback from React. We've all seen that before. And bring in create global state from that React hooks global state, the Daishi Kato library, and then also Axios from Axios. And I'm going to use that create global state to create a global state. It's going to have an object that has in it the JWT token, which we're going to initialize to an empty string. And then I'm going to get back use global state, get global state, and set global state. So use global state is what I would be using if I just was using React code. And get global state and set global state are when you've got code that is outside of React that wants to set or get that global state, which in this case would be that Axios code. So they use get global state and set global state. And then I'm going to kind of make it easy on myself. I'm going to wrap these up into some essentially selectors. So I'm going to have get JWT token, which basically just gets the global state of that JWT token. Set JWT token, which just sets that based on a value that it gets in. These are just functions, and all I do is just set the global state of JWT token to that value. This JWT token matches this key right here. And then, of course, use JWT token, which is what we would use in the React context. All right, so the next thing we need to do is create our Axios client. So we use axios.create to create a client, and we give it the base host, which in this case is localhost 3000. That's where our GraphQL server is located. Since we're going to be doing cores, I'm going to go and add the allow access control origin cores header, as well as the usual content type for application JSON. And then I'm going to create an interceptor. And I love that interceptor, that word. I've been a huge fan of the word interceptor since the original Mad Max Road Warrior, V8 Interceptor. I love interceptors. Anyway, whatever. So in this case, an Axios interceptor basically is some middleware that gets run before or after the request is made to alter the request. So in this case, we are going to, well, we don't need to console log that out, but we do need to go and set that X-access token to the token that we get from JWT token, which is going to start off being empty, of course. And then we're just going to return that config. And if there's an error, then we just reject it. It's fine. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to build out a custom hook for this. And this custom hook is going to be called use client. So it's going to give us back the JWT. It's going to give us back a method for login, log out, and also get to-dos eventually. So it's going to have all the stuff required by the React code to interact with that Axios client and make the requests to the server. So of course, the most important thing we need to do is log in. So this is where I'm going to use that use callback that we brought in at the beginning. And we're going to use that use callback to create a login function. And that login function is going to take a name and a password. And it's going to use the client that we created above here with our Axios create to post to slash. We're going to give it the query, which in this case is the mutation that we had before, as well as the name and password. So this is effectively what we were doing over in our sandbox over here. This is the mutation that we're making, is this one right here, and those are the variables that we're sending along, except in this case we're not just sending Jane123 like we have it hard-coded here. We're sending whatever we have in the code. So in that case it's name and password. And we're also going to use with credentials to say that we want to pass along any cookies that we get. We're not getting any cookies yet. We get those with the refresh token later. All right, and then coming back, we get data, and that's going to have our JWT in it, hopefully. Now, I'm just going to do the happy path here. You want to handle all the edge case and error cases yourself. So once we get that data, we're going to call set JWT, which we got back from our use JWT token up here. We got the basically setter and getter, just like a standard use state. And that's going to set that JWT. Then we need our logout function. That just basically sets it to an empty string. In reality, you're probably going to want to call the server to actually formally log out, but I just want to make this pretty easy. And of course, then we want to return all this, the JWT, the login, and the logout. And hey, we'll also export the client, although we're not going to use that. But we are going to use this use client right here for our React stuff. So let's go over into our app.tsx and start bringing that in. So the first thing I'm going to do is upgrade our import from React to bring in use state and use callback. Then I'm going to bring in that client that we just created with its use client. And then down on the app, I'm going to turn this into a return statement. I'm going to say that this is our to-dos app and change this to to-dos app. And then at the top of this, I'm going to bring in our use client to get the login, the logout, and the JWT. And then I'm also going to set up use states for the name and the password, as well as the login callback. And we're going to initialize the name and password to be Sally and 123, just to make it a little bit easier on ourselves. And finally, we need to go and bring in the UI for this. So I'm going to replace all of this kind of placeholder UI with some UI that has a 2-column layout. So we've got a grid, 2 columns with a little bit of gap in between. And then on the left-hand side, it's going to have the login or logout UI. So in this case, if we've got a JWT, then we say logout. If we don't have a JWT, then we got a login over here. And then we'll bring in the to-dos UI in this second section, which will be on the right-hand side. So let's give this a try. We'll go over here to the host, and then we'll do yarn start. Okay, cool. Looks like we've got our UI. So let's go and inspect what we're going to do here. We'll go over to the network, make that a little bigger, and then we'll hit login. And then we get blocked on a CORS request. So we need to go and upgrade the server to allow for CORS access because we're doing that with credentials. So let's go back over here to our server, stop it, and then go back into our server code. And the way that we enable CORS is to add on the CORS key to say what the origin is going to be, what the acceptable methods are, and that we are expecting credentials to go along with it. So we'll save that out and we'll restart the server. And now we'll try logging in again, and it looks like we're good. Looks like we got a JWT back. So we're doing a post on localhost 3000. We can see the mutation down here, and then we can see the response we get back has the JWT in it. So yay, we're looking good. Okay, the next thing we want to do is actually go and get those to-dos so we can do a round trip using a JWT. So let's go back over into our Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to close this out and then go back into the client. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of use client, and I'm going to add in get to-dos. So this get to-dos is another use callback. Again, it uses the same thing as before, right? Just like with mutation, we're doing a post, but in this case, we're doing a query where we query for to-dos. Again, we send along the credentials, and then we are going to get that data back and pull out the to-dos from there. And all we need to do at this point is just make sure to expose that as part of the return. And then we're going to go over into our app and bring that in. So we got over here to get to-dos, bring that in. And then we need a place to store it and also fetch it. So we're going to create some state, which is just going to be an array of strings. It's going to have set to-dos and get and to-dos. And we're going to have a callback called on get to-dos, which is actually going to call that get to-dos and await the result. So this is an async method. It's going to wait for the result to come back and then set it. Again, always the happy path on this code. And then finally, we need to actually have that UI to both show it and start the get to-dos. So I'll put that into the right-hand column here. And that's going to make sure that we have a JWT and we have to-dos. And if we do, then we're going to iterate through those to-dos. And also we're going to have a button that gets the to-dos. So let's save that out and we'll take a look. And now we need to log in and we get our to-dos. Cool. Okay. So these are the to-dos for Sally, which is learn GraphQL and learn JWTs, which we're doing right now. Awesome. Okay. So that's part 1 of the video. And now in part 2 of this video, we're going to learn about how to do refresh tokens and also how to get React Query working with all of this. So what is a refresh token? So we've got a 1-hour time limit on the token as we already have specified. But what happens if you want to bring that time limit down? You want it to constantly be going and getting new JWTs every once in a while, but you don't want to go and have the user have to log in every time. So let's say you want to bring the JWT lifetime down to like 5 seconds or so. So we don't want the user to have to log in every 5 seconds. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So how are we going to make it so that we have a nice way where they don't have to log in, but we do have these short-term JWTs? Well, the way that we do that is we use a refresh token. So what's going to happen is when we authenticate, if we authenticate properly, we are going to send back not just the JWT, but we're also going to send back a refresh token as a cookie. And the cookies can't be messed with on the client. So they're secure. And that refresh token will then allow us to, if we get a response from the server saying, oh, that was not authorized, we will be able to go back and call another method called refresh. And as part of our request, we'll be passing along that refresh token cookie. And the server will then look at that refresh token and say, oh, okay, you are, in this case, Sally. And so therefore, I'm going to generate you a new JWT that's going to also, again, last for 5 seconds that has that credentials on it. So you get a refresh token without actually having to log in again. And also I'm going to refresh the refresh token cookie. All right, so let's try this out. So the first thing we need to do is go back over to our code for the server and drop down that time limit to about 5 seconds or so, just to make it really easy on ourselves. So I'll go back over here to our server and index, and we'll see when we vend that JWT, we're going to vend it for a much shorter amount of time. So currently we are expiring it in 1 hour. Let's do it in 5 seconds, just like that. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is format the response. So if we know that they've asked for authenticate, then we are going to also go and add the cookie onto the response. So how do we do that in Apollo server? Well, we add another key here called format response. And what this is going to start off doing is it's going to say, okay, so if we have any errors, meaning that we are not authenticated, then we are going to return a 401. Now, normally in Apollo, even an error is going to return a 200. And don't even get me started on that. I think that's a terrible idea. But we actually need to force it to do the 401. So that's going to help us on the Axios side, because Axios is expecting that if you've got an error, you're going to get a bad response code. So we need to make that happen. And this is the code that we need to use on the GraphQL side to make sure that we get a 401 response if I go back for the to-dos and I'm no longer validated because my token has run out. So the next thing we need to do is vend out the cookie. So if that's not the case, if I did authenticate, or in which case we're gonna have this authenticate on data coming back, or it's a response to refresh, which is a new mutation that we'll add, then we're gonna go and create a new refresh token. So we create the token expiry date by going and adding 7 days onto today. We go and use GUID to create that refresh token GUID. And then we're going to get the data coming out of the response from the authenticate or the refresh that we just did, because we want to see that name. What do we authenticate as? So that's going to come back as data here. And then we're going to create a map called refresh tokens that maps from the refresh token to the identity. And that's going to be just something that we manage on the server. So there's no way to spoof that. You'd have to hack the server itself in order to reclaim that identity with that refresh token. And then we use a JWT to build the refresh token itself. We give it a long expiry date, and we just sign it with the GUID that we got back from before. So what's going to happen is when we ask for a refresh, we're going to get that GUID, that refresh token GUID. We're going to look it up in this refresh tokens object. And then if it's valid, we're going to say, okay, here's a new JWT based on that identity. And then finally, we're going to set the cookie coming back from the client that's going to have that refresh token in it. So we got to store those somewhere. So let's go up to the top of the file and we'll create a new object called refresh tokens, which is going to be that map that goes between the refresh token and the user that's assigned to. But we also need to update our context. So let's go down here to the context creator. Now before it was just managing the name, but now we want it to also pass along that refresh token if there is one. So I'm going to replace this code with some extra code that's going to map that. So we're going to add on refresh token to the context. And we're going to see if there's any cookies. If there's some cookies, then we're actually going to do the parsing ourselves of the cookie to go and to turn this cookie string into an object that has cookie value and name and value on it. And we're going to use that to get the refresh token, which is going to be on that cookies. And we're going to add that to our context. And then we're going to have what we had before when we looked at the access token. So now we need to go and add on to our typedefs. We need to go and add an additional mutation. So we're going to add refresh. And that's not going to take any parameters because the way that we're going to get that refresh token is, again, from those cookies. And of course, we need a resolver for that. So let's go down here to our mutation. We have authenticate already. So we're going to add in the mutation for refresh. Now, refresh doesn't care about the parent, doesn't care about the arguments because there are no arguments, but it does care about that refresh token that's coming in from that cookie. And all it needs to do is verify that that refresh token is for realsies. And then it's going to go and look up that GUID, which is what's in the refresh token, and see, okay, so is it in there? And if it is in there, then it's going to have the user identity. So we're going to use that, the refresh tokens on that token data, to get the original user identity. So if it was Sally, Sally would have the JWT that has her name in it, that username, but she's also going to have that refresh token cookie. So let's save that out and try it out. So we're going to go down here to our server. We're going to rerun it. All right, looking good. So let's go back over to our UI. And I'm going to hit refresh and then log in. And what I want to see in the response headers coming back is I want to see, there you go, set cookie. So that's coming back from the server and saying, cool, this is our refresh token. So that's awesome. That's a great start. And that's going to implicitly be added to any subsequent requests. So in this case, you've got the cookie, which is the AJS anonymous ID, but in subsequent requests, we're going to get that refresh token also going out as part of the request. So now let's do the tricky bit over in the client. So let's go over to our code in the host, over in source client. And what we're going to do is create an interceptor here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that if we get a response from the server saying that we're 401, meaning that we're not authenticated anymore, we are going to retry. And this is going to be something that Axios does on its own. Axios is going to see that we tried to get to-dos and that the token was not valid. And so we're going to go back and ask for a refresh. We're going to call that post with that mutation refresh. And assuming that we get the token back, we're then going to set the token again, and then we're going to retry the request, which is really cool because it means as the user of this Axios client, I don't actually have to care on each and every request if that request was invalid on a token and then go and remake that request. It's automatically going to happen for me. So that's really cool. All right, let's try it out and see if that's going to work. So we'll go over to our host, we'll restart. And now here's what I should expect to see. So we're going to do our login. That's going to work. And then I'm going to get to-dos, and that's going to work. And then after a certain amount of time, 5 seconds, I'm going to try it again, and that's going to not work. That's going to give us our 401 unauthorized back. So we're seeing that right here. We get this response to the 401 unauthorized to our request for to-dos. So then we call subsequently a request for a mutation to refresh. That gives us back a updated JWT that we then recall query to-dos, and we get back the to-dos. Awesome. So you no longer have to care as the person who's writing the code to go and get the to-dos if you are unauthorized. It's just going to go back and ask for another token, and away you go. Now, of course, if the long-running refresh token runs out, then you will get an error, and because we're only going to retry the once, and then you'll need to resend the person back to the login. So, whew, that was a lot of code. So amazing stuff. Okay, let's finish this up by getting this integrated with React Query. So I'm going to go back over to our app code and then bring in React Query. I'm going to create a query client right down here using new query client from React Query. And now I've got to wrap the app in that provider. So that's just a React Query thing. So I'm going to create a new component called app, and then I'm going to use that app as my basis for the app as opposed to the do's app. So let's see if this is running. Let's go back over to our app. Okay, looks pretty good. Everything's still running fine. So let's go over and replace our fetch code that would do the to-dos with React Query instead. So in this case, we're going to use useQuery. We're going to give it the key of to-dos, and we're going to give it get to-dos. So React Query actually doesn't make queries itself. It uses a query function to do it, and get to-dos fits that bill perfectly. And then the final thing we need to do is do on get to-dos and update that to, instead of doing the management ourselves, we just invalidate the to-dos. Okay, let's try it out. So refresh, I'm going to log in. That looks pretty good. I'm going to get the to-dos, and it did it automatically. That's pretty cool. And that's because we have this enabled over here. So the moment that it saw that we had a valid JWT, it made the request to go and get the to-dos. And then finally, I'm going to get the to-dos again, and we can see after 5 seconds or so that we get the 401, and then we get automatically the request for the updated data. Just like that. All right, well, that was pretty epic. So many technologies involved in all this, and it's a very intricate dance when it comes to the JWTs and the refresh tokens, and I really hope that this code acts as a template that you can use to at least get you started in your journey around JWTs and refresh tokens. Of course, if you have any questions, be sure to put those in the comment section down below. If you like the video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you really like the video, be sure to hit the subscribe button, ring that bell, and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.